Well, good afternoon, folks. I have to say that after a morning tour and a late lunch, I thought I might be alone in here this afternoon at 4 o'clock. I did a lecture last year, and it was when we were in Niagara Falls in the morning, hot day in July, came back lunchtime. Then my lecture was at 2 p.m., and I did put half the people there to sleep. They had a lovely little nap while I was talking. So hopefully that doesn't happen this afternoon. I just want to point out as well, too, just because we're here right now, so we're going through the middle of Lake St. Clair right now. It's a beautiful little lake. The average depth is only 14 feet. And this ship is a little bit deeper than that, as are all the other freighters. So they have a channel that goes through the middle of the lake. You can actually see it on Google Maps. They have to dredge consistently to keep it at its depth of about 28 and a half feet, but it's only about 800 feet wide. And so that's why I see those freighters, they're quite close to us. That's on purpose because it's a very narrow channel that we have to work with. And it would have been the channel that the Edmund Fitzgerald would have taken down on its last trip, as it had so many other times today. This song really resonates with me, both as a lover of music, as a lover of Gordon Lightfoot, but also personal, too. I have a personal connection. If I forget, remind me at the end to my personal connection of this story and that fateful night. And it's such a well-known shipwreck in the Great Lakes, but as I'm going to show you in a few minutes, there's been lots of other shipwrecks in the Great Lakes, and actually I have a whole other lecture in a few days about other shipwrecks in the Great Lakes. But it's the connection of what happened that night with, I think, just an absolutely amazing song, and that's what I want to put together for you today. But it is one of those stories. It's kind of like when you go watch the movie Titanic. You know what's going to happen at the end already, so we know what's happening at the end here. But it's those little things along the way. It's the personal story of the people, and that's what we want to focus on today as well. So the Edmund Fitzgerald was known as the Queen of the Lakes when it was launched. It was the largest ship on the Great Lakes, and if we take a look at its stats, it was 729 feet long, 75 feet wide, so it would have fit through the other locks that we went through, but it didn't usually. It didn't go out into the Welland Canal at all. Its destination was usually the bottom of Lake Michigan, where we're off to, or the bottom of Lake Erie. 29 crew on board, as we're on board that night, and we can compare that to our ship, the Polaris, which is built for polar waters, a little bit shorter, but actually a little bit wider than the Edmund Fitzgerald, and at about the same draft. But unlike the Edmund Fitzgerald, especially our crew capacity is a little bit higher, because I think if you were on this ship with 29 crew, you'd have a couple of things to say about the service at the end of the cruise. So we threw a few extra on with you on our ship. And of course, this story is also about, I think, an amazing man, Gordon Lightfoot. So Gordon Lightfoot was a singer-songwriter, just died a couple of years ago. He was from a small town called Orillia, Ontario, just a couple hours north of Toronto, where you folks started this cruise. Very well-known internationally, but beloved in Canada. He had 50 Juno wins. Junos are the equivalent of Grammys in Canada. He was nominated 5 times for the Grammys themselves, and he had 7 #1 selling records. And his songs were often stories about the people and places of Canada, very personal stories. He had his demons, he had his ups and downs, in both professionally and personally in his career, but he loved performing. I saw him perform twice, once in the 90s and once near the very end of his career, and his favorite expression when he was playing songs, because he wasn't much of a talker, and if you've watched documentaries about it, it's what everyone says. He wasn't the guy that's going to stand up on stage that would tell stories. He'd play a song, everyone would clap, and he'd go, "Thank you very much, we love the work," and then he'd start another song again. So that's kind of what he did. But he was also well connected to the nautical world. Orillia is very close to Georgian Bay. He was an avid canoeist and sailor for much of his life. This is one of his favorite ships that he owned at one point, a beautiful, it's about 40-foot long wooden sailing vessel called the Golden Goose. And he actually competed in 2 very prestigious races on the Great Lakes using this ship. And one of them, we're actually retracing the route, because it starts in Port Huron. They still have it every year. So Port Huron is the city on the American side where the St. Clair River meets Lake Huron. So when we pass under the Blue Water Bridge later today, we'll have Port Huron on our port side. And that race goes from Port Huron to Mackinac Island, where we're going to be tomorrow. And then the other famous race on the Great Lakes is from Chicago, also to Mackinac Island. So they happen every summer, and he raced in both of those on that vessel. This was also not his first attempt at writing a song about a ship. I didn't know about this till I started doing research a couple of years ago for this lecture. But there was a ship called the Yarmouth Castle. It was quite an old ship, and at the time in the 1960s, it was a sort of a bit of a cruise ship, and it was doing regular runs from Miami and Florida over into the Bahamas. And in the fall of 1965, a fire broke out about 1 o'clock in the morning on the Yarmouth Castle. Quite sadly, quite a few of the crew left the ship, including the captain. He said they were going to get help, so they lowered themselves into a lifeboat and took off looking for help. It was a horrific accident. Many dozens of people died, and it actually really changed standards internationally on how we deal with fires on ships. But Gordon Lightfoot heard about that incident, and a couple of years later, he wrote a song called The Ballad of Yarmouth Castle. So there is another song out there by Gordon Lightfoot about a ship in trouble. And the word ballad is important there too, because that's what the song that we're going to talk about today is. It really is a true ballad in that sort of style of the old, thinking back to royal courts hundreds and hundreds of years ago, where you had the musician which would play songs, but the songs were like oral histories. And that's what this song is. There is no bridge in this song. There's no chorus in this song. So it was a very unlikely song to be a hit, especially as we're going to find out back in the 1970s. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that this wasn't the only shipwreck. Oh, here goes one by right now. This is how close we get on either side here because of the length of the channel. So that's the same company that some ones that were in the Welland Canal where we were in the other day from Algoma's company. Yeah. So that's a Laker, and that is a self-unloader. It has a sort of a long, looks like a ladder on its deck, and so it can self-unload its cargo, usually things like potash, grain, iron ore, and limestone. Anyways, got to focus on this lecture because it's already going to be too long, I tell you already. So I just want to give you a couple of examples. So less than a decade before the Edmund Fitzgerald sunk, the Daniel Almoral sunk in the very bottom of, into the bottom, but near the bottom of Lake Huron, where we're going to be in a few hours. It was a horrific accident. It was near the end of November that year. The ship broke in two. There was quite a few people still working on the bow at the time, and they reported that the bow, the stern, actually kept motoring past the bow, and they found the two parts of the ship miles apart from each other. There was only one survivor from this tragedy out of 32, and they found him many hours after the ship had sunk on top of a couple of other bodies in a life raft, half frozen himself. He needed 14 surgeries after that. So one survivor from that. It was a very gripping story. The Cedarville, the year before, it was struck by another vessel only 1 mile east of the Mackinac Bridge, so very close to where we're going to be tomorrow. And 1/3 of the men, they were carrying a crew of 35, and 1/3 of the men on that ship died. The Carl Bradley sunk in 1958, and it also, like the Morrow, broke into two pieces. A huge tragedy for the area that we're going to be tomorrow. I keep thinking Mackinac's tomorrow, so forgive me. I know it's the day after. Alpena's tomorrow. But just north of Alpena, there's a little place called Rogers City. Only 2 men out of 35 survived this tragedy, but 23 of the men were all from Rogers City, so a small city. So basically everybody in that town had a connection to someone that died. And then a couple of years before that, up on Lake Superior, the Henry Stuyvesant floundered in very heavy seas between the Upper Peninsula of Michigan and Isle Royal, and 2/3 of the men, including the captain, died on this one as well. So a lot of tragedy has happened for centuries, and even in the decades before the Edmund Fitzgerald, but I honestly believe it's that song. It's kind of like the Titanic was starting not to drift, but not as many people were thinking about the Titanic when Walter Lord's book came out in the 1950s, followed by the movie, A Night to Remember, a couple of years later, and that restoked a lot of interest and kept things going. And you think for millennials, they would have thought that they invented the idea of thinking about the Titanic with the movie in 1997. So I believe Gordon Lightfoot's song did, and he really researched this song, as we're going to see. So what I'm going to propose to you is that we're going to take a look at the song verse by verse. So I'm going to read a verse, and then we're going to talk a little bit about the history of the verse. And then at the end, because I've been reading, I'm definitely not singing the verse, we'll get Gordon up on the screen at one of his best performances of it as well. So hopefully that works for you. So we'll start off with verse 1. Gordon kind of sets the scene for folks, especially folks that might not be familiar with the Great Lakes. The legend lives on from the Chippewa on down of the big lake they call Gitchigumi. The lake, it is said, never gives up her dead when the skies of November turn gloomy. With a load of iron ore, 26,000 tons more than the Edmund Fitzgerald weighed empty, that good ship and true was a bone to be chewed when the gales of November came early. Now, I sing a barbershop chorus, and the hardest part for me is hearing the words, because I'm a guy that hears music, I don't hear words. So I was very surprised to see on there that good ship and true, because if I heard anything, I heard good ship and crew. This is what when the kids are playing their video games, this is what they call an Easter egg, a little hidden thing that's you have to be kind of in the know. Gordon was so in the know about shipping that true means that a ship is very reliable. So it's a nautical term. So he meant to include that word true in there. But let's take a look at those first set of lyrics. So he talks about the Chippewa. So the Chippewa are an indigenous people that live around the Great Lakes, but the name's a little bit confusing. So the Chippewa is the English translation of the name that another First Nation gave to those people. And so as they encountered explorers, they say, well, who's next? Who's in the next sort of lake over? And they would call them the Chippewa or something along that line. And that is because in their language, that translated into the puckered moccasin people, because they had a very unique design with their moccasins compared to many other indigenous people. Now, that's the English translation. The French translation is more Ojibwe. So that's why you hear sometimes Chippewa, mostly on the American side, and Ojibwe, mostly on the Canadian side. Myself, I'm a firm believer in calling people what they want to be called. And these people all call themselves the Anishinaabe people. So that's the term that most people now in Canada, at least, and some in the United States will use to describe these people we call the Chippewa. We also, in the song here, mention of Gitchigumi, which is the Anishinaabe-Moan, or the indigenous language word for Lake Superior. Gitchigumi you also might have heard from the poem Hiawatha as well by Longfellow. Now Longfellow got that phrase, Gitchigumi, from a man named Henry Schoolcraft. Many of you on the walking tour on Mackinac Island are going to hear about Henry Schoolcraft because he worked on that island. He was the first European to visit Lake and name Lake Itasca, the headwaters of the Mississippi River. So a very famous person in this area. Unfortunately, he got the translation a little bit wrong. There is not an indigenous group out there that uses the word Gitchigumi. Most often it's Kitchigami, and which basically again means big water or big lake or big sea is kind of the translation. So you'll see a lot of stores and things that reference Lake Superior that use that word, either Kitchigami or Gitchigumi. And finally, we're talking about iron ore in this story. So the iron ore range that is in northern Minnesota, that kind of parallels that shore of Lake Superior, has been a very important source of iron ore, backbone of even at the Fort Rouge plant that we're at today, for example. And in this case, it was carrying taconite, small little pellets about this big, process that had been developed at the University of Minnesota Duluth the decade before that happened. So that's just the first, and now we've a first verse, and now we have sort of the setting for our song. And let's go on to verse 2. The ship was the pride of the American side, coming back from some mill in Wisconsin. As the big freighters go, it was bigger than most, with a crew and good captain well seasoned. Concluding some terms with a couple of steel firms when they left fully loaded for Cleveland. And later that night, when the ship's bell rang, could it be the north wind they'd been feeling? Now, just before we go on, now he is kind of right that they are heading fully loaded for Cleveland, but they weren't going to be fully loaded when they got to Cleveland. The destination of this shipment was actually Zug Island, right near the River Rouge in Detroit. So the ship was supposed to end its voyage with its cargo from there, and then after that, it was heading off to Cleveland, its home port. This was its last run of the winter. So just to clear that up before we go on to talk a little bit about this. So really was the pride of the American side. We're going to see in the song, there's going to be a couple of flashbacks, so we'll see the actual launch of the Edmund Fitzgerald, which happened in 1958. It was named after the man who at the time was the president of the Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company. Another connection to our trip, because that's one of the tallest buildings in Milwaukee, and we're going to be looking right at that off of our bow when we dock in Milwaukee, when we get there in a couple of days. Launched in 1958, thousands and thousands of people came out to see the launch of it. Wasn't the most auspicious start for the ship. A couple things went wrong. Number one, when Mrs. Fitzgerald went to bang the champagne against the ship, it didn't break. She had to do it 3 times before it broke, which is bad luck if in the sailing world. It launched on the side, and they had a very hard time getting it to actually go down. And once it did, a tremendous wave came up and soaked many of the spectators that were there. It was quite the sight, scared quite a few people, scared one man so badly he had a heart attack and died on sight, unfortunately. So strike number 2, we haven't even started yet. But it was very much, like I said, not just the pride of the American side, but the entire Great Lakes, because it was known as the Queen of the Lakes at the time. It said it was coming back from some mill in Wisconsin. Normally, the Edmund Fitzgerald picked up its taconite at a very small harbor called Silver Bay on the north shore of Minnesota. But for this last trip, it was stopping at these docks, Burlington Northern number 2 docks in Superior. Superior is the sister port to Duluth. So if you've heard of Duluth before, Duluth, Superior are known as the Twin Ports, just like Minneapolis, St. Paul are known as the Twin Cities. I have the Stuart Court up here because it was in 1971 that the Stuart Court was launched, and it became the Queen of the Lakes. It replaced the Edmund Fitzgerald as the largest freighter on the Great Lakes. And it was also the first of the 1,000-footers, something you might want to keep your eye out for the next little while. There are 13 ships on the Great Lake that are more than 1,000 feet long. They can't fit through the Welland Canal or the St. Lawrence River, but they do fit through one lock in Sault Ste. Marie. So they are able to ply 4 out of 5 of the lakes. And then, of course, we talked about the crew and the captain. So Captain Ernest McSorley was the captain, over 40 years' experience on the Great Lakes. It's never been actually proven, but it was well rumored that this was going to be his last trip. His wife was quite ill. She had been living in a nursing home for quite a few years, and a lot of people at the time said that he had said many times that once he was done this trip, he was going to put in his retirement papers. He had 28 other men working on the ship with him, and those are the duties of those men involved. All right, we're on now to verse 3. The winds in the wire made a tattletale sound, and a wave broke over the railing. And every man knew, as the captain did too, 'twas the witch of November come stealing. The dawn came late, and the breakfast had to wait, when the gales of November came slashing. When afternoon came, it was freezing rain in a face of a hurricane west wind. Now, funny enough, when they left Superior, Wisconsin on the afternoon of the 9th, it was such a beautiful day that the men, they actually left without all the hatches being sealed yet, because they were able to work on it in very light clothing as they left the harbor and sailed out underneath the lift bridge into the bay. It was a beautiful, beautiful day. But at the same time, the weather was changing. I know, talking to a couple of guests yesterday, a little unsure about the fog and definitely some of the waves that we had when we were in Point Pelee. For me, that was a really nothing day kind of on the Great Lakes. And when they talk about those fall storms, they really mean storms. And it's because of where the Great Lakes are, and because of phenomena that happens in the fall. Of course, the Great Lakes are always cold, but come fall time, they're actually warmer than the surrounding air. And we get the weather systems coming across Canada from the Canadian Rockies. We call those Alberta Clippers. And you get other weather patterns coming up from the United States Rockies. You call those Colorado lows. When those two weather patterns meet over the Great Lakes, which has a warmness to it still, it helps to produce even more energy and helps to amplify storms that are already quite large. It is very not uncommon to hear of wave heights of 25 feet during some of these fall storms. So going to turn into a meteorologist here for a moment, just to give you an idea of what was happening that day. So on the morning of the 9th, when they were getting ready up in Superior there on Lake Superior, there was a weather system forming over Kansas that started to make its way to the northeast. As it formed completely, it had a pressure reading in inches of about 29.52 inches. And as it made its way northeast, it got closer and closer to the Great Lakes over there, and you see that L with the circle around it. That is now from the late morning of the 10th of November, and now the pressure is about 29 inches. During the course of the day and into the evening, that low pressure went right over Lake Superior, and it bottomed out at 28.8 inches. So that works out to about 975 millibar, if that's more your kind of thing, and for me, 97.3 kilopascals, just to give you some different pressure readings, but a fairly low pressure reading. Anything under about 100 kilopascals is considered a pretty significant storm, and this was definitely under that. And because it was also starting on one side of Lake Superior and ending up on the other side, it meant that as it went over the lake, the winds started to come from the other direction. So now you're getting winds from two directions as well. So we got to keep that in mind too. So a little bit of trying to enlarge this map as far as I could, which means we lose the resolution a little bit, but a really important map to show you on here for a couple of reasons. So number one, there's Superior right at the very head of the lakes, and that's where the Edmund Fitzgerald left from. But at the same time, about another ship, the Arthur M. Anderson, was leaving from two harbors, also loaded with iron ore and also planning to make the same track. The captains started talking to each other, and a very typical thing for captains to do if they sense bad weather coming on Lake Superior is to try to head north more towards our Royal and the Canadian shore. Because normally the shipping lanes go just over the Upper Peninsula here north of Copper Harbor as they make their way down to the other end of the lake. So these tracks show that the captains were well aware that there was bad weather coming. It wasn't unusually, like there had been worse November storms and there were other ships out. So it was no fault of, no one could say that, oh, Captain McSorley, he shouldn't have gone out in that weather. Because he certainly wasn't the only one out there. And then by the time it really, really got bad, that's when their tracks are over here on the other side. So they went very close to the Canadian side as they started to come down. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to get over here. They're trying to get to Whitefish Bay. Where's my Whitefish Bay? There it is. I'm trying to get to Whitefish Bay because Whitefish Bay has much more protected waters. And even if the storm was still bad, they could ride it out there. Now, this is a picture of the Arthur M. Anderson, the other ship that was traveling with it. I took this picture in Duluth Superior Harbor last June. The Arthur M. Anderson is still plying the lakes. It was built in the 1950s, and it was put into dry dock for a couple of years, about a decade ago, but it's back in service again, so it's still out on the lakes, and it plays very much into this story as well. And the last thing I want to mention, because in the song he talks about in the afternoon how the wind was really picking up and everything, well, it actually had already done some damage to the Edmund Fitzgerald. And this was one of the radio messages between the Captain McSorley of the Fitzgerald with the captain of the Anderson, where he says, "Anderson, this is the Fitzgerald. I have a fence rail down, 2 vents lost or damaged, and a list. I'm checking down. Will you stay with me till I get to Whitefish?" And that's why we see their paths so close together here, because they were kind of relying on each other at this point, especially when they run around here, Caribou Island, just over on the Canadian side. North of Caribou Island is a shoal called the 6 Fathom Shoal, 6 feet to a fathom, so about 36 feet deep there. And it's a shoal at the time that wasn't that well charted. All right, next verse. When supper time came, the old cook came on deck saying, "Fellas, it's too rough to feed ya." At 7 p.m., a main hatchway caved in. He said, "Fellas, it's been good to know ya." The captain wired in, he had water coming in, and the good ship and crew was in peril. And later that night, when its lights went out of sight, came the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. So, of course, most people know that there were no survivors of the Edmund Fitzgerald, so we don't know. We have information from the Anderson that was out there, but we don't actually know what happened in those last minutes and hours even on the Edmund Fitzgerald. Lots of different artists have tried to sort of recreate that night over the years, including the Great Lakes Brewing Company, which brews a beer called the Edmund Fitzgerald. So it was a terrible, terrible afternoon and evening for all the ships that were on Lake Superior, because it really was a difficult storm to get through. One thing to mention before I go on, though, is one of the lines in there saying at 7 p.m. a main hatchway gave in. So this is something that got very contentious after the Edmund Fitzgerald sunk. What caused it to sink? And to this day, actually, nobody knows for sure what happens. But there's a lot of people out there that they have their opinion, and they can defend it very strongly. But at the time, when the first inquiry happened, led by the U.S. Coast Guard, they determined that it was hatches that were improperly dogged down, which means they weren't tightened properly. The shipping companies and definitely the Lake Carriers Union that represents the sailors on the Great Lakes argued vehemently against that. And they were eventually vindicated. About 15 years ago or so, almost 20 years ago actually, there was a documentary on the History Channel, The Dive Detectives was a series, and they did a very detailed computer study using all the information that collected about the Fitzgerald, and they concluded, we still don't know what sunk it, but we're pretty 99% sure that it was not hatches, based on the evidence of the photographs of the hatches on the Fitzgerald, which rests now at the bottom of Lake Superior. So Gordon Lightfoot did something very, very interesting. He didn't re-record the song or anything, but from that point on in his live presentations of this song, he changed that line. It no longer said at 7 p.m. the main hatchway gave. At 7 p.m. it grew dark. It was then he said, "Fella, it's been good to know you." He wanted to honor those, especially the families who had fought for years, because, of course, hatches improperly closed, that means human error. And so that means it was one of the crew members or more fault that the Edmund Fitzgerald sunk. And he strongly did not believe that and agreed with them, and so he changed the words. So we get back to some communication. There wasn't just the Anderson that the Edmund Fitzgerald was communicating with. He was communicating with the Avrafor, which is a salty ocean-going vessel, which was in Whitefish Bay at the time, where he said, "I have a bad list. I have lost both radars and am taking on heavy seas over the deck in one of the worst seas I have ever been in." Because he had lost his radar, he was really now relying on the radar of the Anderson, and that's why they were so close together, less than 10 miles apart. But unfortunately, something happened with the radar. And the other thing that also happened that was absolutely awful for the Fitzgerald was the only thing it had left was it could hone in on radio beacons, and all life-saving stations and lighthouses at the time had radio beacons. The closest one was the lighthouse at Whitefish Point, but unfortunately that storm knocked out power to the area and had knocked all the power out to Whitefish Point, so they couldn't even hone in on that radio beacon anymore. Now in the song he talks about at 10 p.m. Well, yes, at 7:10 p.m. that's when the last message was sent from the Edmund Fitzgerald. It was from Captain McSorley to then the first officer on the Anderson, where he said, "We are holding our own, going on like an old shoe," and he was responding to a course indication that the Anderson had given him. And then about a few minutes later, a snow squall passed over the area, and it affected the Anderson's radar. So they lost all radar capabilities for just a few minutes. And when that storm had passed and the radar was fully operational again, the Edmund Fitzgerald was not on the screen anymore. The first mate tried quite a few times to radio into the Fitz, got his captain up on the bridge, of course, too. Captain tried to radio to the Fitz, and at 7:39, the captain of the Anderson made his first call to the Coast Guard in Sault Ste. Marie to try to get a rescue started, and we'll talk about that rescue in a moment. This next verse to me this is Gordon's best verse, and this first couple lines just, sort of hit you. "Does anyone know where the love of God goes when those waves turn the minutes to hours? The searchers all say they'd have made Whitefish Bay if they put 15 more miles behind her. They might have split up, or they might have capsized. They may have broke deep and took water. And all that remains is the faces and the names of the wives and the sons and the daughters. So absolutely, they might have done this, they might have done that. We don't know to this day. There's a captain was out on the lake that night with his ship. His name was Captain Paquette. He strongly believed that there was already structural damage that the company kind of knew about and hadn't fully investigated yet. That led to it. That 6-fathom shoal, as the waves, when you hit the troughs, the bottom part of the waves, the ship could go down far enough that it could have scraped along that shoal. It could have broken in two at the surface. As we'll see, it was found in 2 pieces at the bottom, but that could have also happened on the way down. There were tremendous waves that night. The Anderson itself reported waves of about 58 to 60 knots with gusts up to 75 knots and reported waves of up to 35 feet high. Rogue waves. There's a phenomenon on the Great Lakes, especially on Lake Superior, called the Three Sisters, where sailors have seen, and this has been measured with buoys, you get a rogue wave, but on the Great Lakes you get 3 of them, and each one is bigger than the one before it. And the Anderson reported about the time a huge wave coming over the stern and washing over the entire ship there. So, and that's a whole nother lecture just talking about the different theories. So we'll leave that part for now. But here we have the lake again. We have Duluth Superior where the voyage started, and then way over there the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. You can see it's just inside the Canadian border, and the memorial is at Whitefish Point. That lighthouse is now a museum as well, a museum of shipwrecks of the Great Lake, but very much focused on the Edmund Fitzgerald. So the call went out for help. Unfortunately, again, a lot of things went wrong that night. There were 2 U.S. Coast Guard ships in Sault Ste. Marie in Whitefish Bay here. One of them was much too small to go out in that kind of weather, and the other one was having mechanical problems. The only U.S. Coast Guard ship that could come and help was in Duluth, and they were immediately launched, but they had to make that entire trip to the other side of the lake first. So the Coast Guard asked ships that were in Whitefish Bay already, some that had just arrived, others that had been waiting out the storm there, to go out and look on the storm. On YouTube, you can listen to the radio conversation between the captain of the Anderson, who was now safely in Whitefish Bay, and the United States Coast Guard. And you can hear in the captain's voice that heaviness when the Coast Guard asks him to turn his ship around after having just dealt with this for the past 12, 15 hours and go back out and look. But he did. He took his ship back out there. They started to find debris a few hours later, not that much. At the same time, Ontario Provincial Police officers were dispatched and were looking for both debris and bodies along the Canadian shoreline here. Debris was found over the next few days and weeks, and in fact into the next year as well. I've been to this provincial park. It says Pakasaw National Park up there, but a little bit to the left of that is a park called Nays Provincial Park. And at the visitor center of that park, they have one of the life buoys from the Edmund Fitzgerald, which washed up on a beach the following year there. So, and we'll see a quick evidence of the damage to one of the lifeboats that was recovered in the video at the end. So there wasn't too much they could do beside the sort of aerial search and the shoreline search because, of course, late November, the lake's starting to freeze up. It wasn't until the following May that they were able to get another ship on site with a submersible to head down and to find the Edmund Fitzgerald and take some pictures of it. So this is the Edmund Fitzgerald resting on the bottom of the lake. This is the pilot house, so at the time in the bow section, and this is what the Edmund Fitzgerald looks like now on the bottom of Lake Superior. So we have the bow section here, and then we have the stern section. The stern section is upside down. It's flipped over, and there is over 100 feet. If you measure the bow section, measure the stern section, there's between 100 and 200 feet that are missing. So part of the ship just sort of evaporated, and the debris field is all around the bottom of the lake. So we had that first visit in 1976. In 1980, Jacques Cousteau and his company were doing a documentary through all of the Great Lakes on the Calypso, and they took a submersible down, but just spent about 15, 20 minutes. They didn't really do any investigations, just took a couple of pictures. It wasn't until the late 1980s that a couple of expeditions went down, scientific expeditions, to try as best as they could to document the wreck, to help to find an answer to it. Things got a little carried away in the 1990s. So in the 1990s, we kind of have two men involved with this. So we have this guy named Tom Farkas. For many years, he was the director, the manager of the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum at Whitefish Point. We had this other guy, Fred Shannon, a retired police officer, avid diver. And in 1994, Fred Shannon had a expedition called Expedition 94. They were going to make both a book and a video documentary. And one of the things they said they saw during their filming was a body outside of the bow section. And they were going to show that in both the documentary and publish it in the book, and that really, really upset the families. Tom Farkas and Fred Shannon could not stand each other. Often happens when it comes to shipwrecks. One person thinks they're more of the expert, and they almost kind of like adopt it as their own. And so there's a lot of tension between the two men. And Tom actually exploited this anger that the families had for Fred Shannon, and he helped to convince the families to petition the governments of Canada and the United States to do a proper memorial for the Edmund Fitzgerald. And what that involved was bringing up the actual bell. So on July 4th of 1995, a ship went out with some support vessels over where the wreck was. They sent a diver down in a very special suit called a newt suit. It was designed by a Canadian, and he went down and used welding equipment to actually remove the bell and bring it up to the surface. One documentary that I watched, one of the wives of the men on board, she talked in the video about when that bell first broke the surface, and it rang once as it broke the surface. And that for her was her sort of closure with this whole event. It was very important for the families that they have something from it. But taking something meant leaving something, and so on July the 5th, the next day, that same diver went down with an exact replica of the bell with all 29 names inscribed on it, and it was put back in the same spot that the bell was. So you can visit at Whitefish Point Museum now. You can see the bell. There's a whole lot of controversy about the bell too. That's a whole another lecture, but it's absolutely amazing. So much controversy in this event. So that's how it ended up. And then that fall, so that was in the summer of 1995, that late August, a couple of guys from Florida got it in their head, hey, let's go free dive on the Edmund Fitzgerald. So they drove up from Florida, hired a boat, took them out to the wreck site with just regular diving equipment, dove down to the Edmund Fitzgerald. They basically had enough time to touch the handrail before they had to start their decompressions all the way up, and that was it. Now it was turning into a bit of a circus. So now the families petitioned the Ontario government, which is in charge of the wreck because it's just inside Ontario waters, and in 2006 it was made a historic site. Any activity around it is forbidden or would require the permission of the government, which would then require the permission of the families. Second last verse. We're getting there, folks. This one, I think he wanted to make sure that people that weren't from the Great Lakes area knew kind of the area that we were talking about. And so I think it's an important verse for us as we're experiencing so much of these Great Lakes right now on this voyage. Lake Huron rolls, Superior sings in the rooms of her ice water mansion. Old Michigan steams like a young man's dreams. The islands and bays are for sportsmen. And farther below, Lake Ontario takes in what Lake Erie can send her. And the iron boats go, as the mariners all know, with the gales of November remembered. One more Easter egg he gave us in the song, showing that he's kind of in the know on what's going on in the Great Lakes. You would never, ever want to say the captain on this ship, oh, a nice boat you got here. We're on a ship, right? We're not on a boat. But for some reason, for over 150 years, the freighters on these lakes have always been affectionately known as boats, iron boats. So that term being used here is very appropriate and proper for the Great Lakes. So here's just a chart, a nautical chart of all of our beautiful 5 Great Lakes, just to give you where we are. I see we're in the river now, so we just left Lake St. Clair, and we're just about right here right now, heading up to Lake Huron. And these are all very beautiful lakes, but very different personalities. So he talked first about Lake Huron. There are about 35,000 islands in all the 5 Great Lakes combined. 30,000 of them are in Lake Huron, by far more lakes than any other one. Lake Superior, by far the deepest, the coldest, the one that takes the longest to warm up in the summer if it ever does. I also chose this picture because that's It's one of the most photographed lighthouses on the Great Lakes, Split Rock Lighthouse on the north shore of Minnesota. And it was the last lighthouse that the crew of the Edmund Fitzgerald would have seen. It's an inactive lighthouse now. It's a state park. It's absolutely beautiful there. So the light doesn't function anymore except on November the 10th every year where they have a ceremony to honor them. I'm going to be there this November because they also read out the names of all of the men as part of that ceremony. Lake Michigan, where we're going to be headed to in a couple of days, depending on the route that the captain takes to get to Milwaukee, we might see some of the beautiful sand dunes that are on the eastern shore of the lake. Lake Ontario, there's Port Weller. That's where we first entered into the Welland Canal a few nights ago, late in the evening, and it really does. It takes not only what Lake Erie can send her, but what all the 4 other lakes can. And then Lake Erie, this is Long Point. That's one of the longest peninsulas that sticks out into it, and a very shallow, sandy lake, a lot of turbidity in the water as well. So 5 fascinating bodies of water. And we're at our last verse now. In a musty old hall in Detroit, they prayed in the Maritime Sailors Cathedral. The church bell chimed till it rang 29 times for each man on the Edmund Fitzgerald. The legend lives on from the Chippewa on down of the big lake they called Gitchigumi. Superior, they said, never gives up her dead when the gales of November come early. So another interesting connection. Many of us went right by this today, so this is quite topical for us. The Old Mariners Church, just up from the customs office, and I'm sure your tour guide talked about it as well, built in the 1840s. The woman that spearheaded it, at the time, mariners were very much looked down upon, and she wanted a place where they could feel comfortable to worship and pray as well, so she spearheaded the construction of it. Probably told you on your tour that due to changes in the downtown, it actually had to be moved a few hundred feet at one point as well. And this is the musty old hall that he talks about in his song. And I hope this story is true because it's a wonderful story, because apparently back in the late 1990s, he was doing a show once. Like I said, Gordon plays this song, he finishes, everyone claps, he says, love the work, and he starts singing again. So in that little awkward pause after the clapping before he says something, some guy yelled out in the audience, it's not a musty old hall, it's a beautiful church. Apparently, they connected after the concert. The man explained the church to him. I don't know if it's a true story, but it's a lovely story. But I do know, because I did hear him play in the early 90s and also about a decade ago, that he did change the words again for the second time in the song. And so he changed it so it wasn't a musty old hall, but in a rustic old church that he put in, or a rustic old hall, one or the other. He used to use both of them. Anyways, it is a beautiful church on the outside, and it's absolutely gorgeous on the inside, very nautically themed as well, too. And your tour guide probably told you something today that I wish they would just amend a little bit, because it makes me kind of, no, it's just a little error. So yes, on the next day after the ship sunk in 1975, so on the morning of the 11th, because the ship sunk on the 10th, the rector of the Old Mariners Church, just out of his own idea, went and rang the bell 29 times. And so that became the annual tradition. So every year, on the Sunday closest to November 10th, they would have a service dedicated to the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, where they would ring the bell 29 times. They finally decided in 2006, though, that they wanted to make it more inclusive. So they, with the family's permission, they changed it to ringing the bell 8 times, still having that service. 8 times, one for every 5 of the Great Lakes, one for the Detroit River, St. Clair River, and Lake St. Clair that we just went through, one for the St. Lawrence River, where all this water drains into, and one also for people in the military, including the Coast Guard branch. In Canada, the Coast Guard is not part of the military, so kind of including all those. So that's what they do now. So when your tour guide says they ring the church bell every year for 29 times, they don't anymore. They ring it 8 times, but the thought is still there. However, a couple of years ago, on May the 2nd, the day after Gordon Lightfoot died, at the church, they rang the church bells 30 times, one for each man on the Edmund Fitzgerald and one for Gordon as well. He was so connected to the families. He did at the end called this his finest song, and it was because of the personal connections he had with the families. I'll give you just a couple of examples. When that boat went out in July 4th in 1995 to retrieve the bell, he unfortunately could not be on the boat, but 2 wreaths were thrown into the water, one purchased by all the families and one purchased by Gordon Lightfoot. There, many of the men about almost a quarter of the crew came from Wisconsin, and many of them were from the Superior area. And many years ago, when Gordon heard that they were doing a big fundraiser to fix the roof on the hockey arena that the high school team played, and the fundraising wasn't going well, he cut them a check to make sure that roof got fixed. One of the stories I heard on the morning of May 2nd, where they're interviewing people that knew Gordon, was the niece of one of the wives who lost her husband, the Edmund Fitzgerald. Gordon would keep in touch with all the families. He would try to get to the annual service that they had at Whitefish Point. And according to this niece, about 2 weeks before her aunt died of cancer, Gordon found out that she was terminally ill, and made a point of calling her and having one last conversation. So it was an incredible connections that he had. And it was an incredible story for the song itself. So Gordon read a story in Newsweek magazine about 2 weeks after the tragedy. He read about it, and he used that kind of the basis of the lyrics he started, and of course those iconic guitar notes that he played. He was kind of playing around with them a lot, and he played around with them in the following winter when they were recording a new album, him and his band. And he and his band were together. Like the guys, when I saw them 10 years ago, it was the same guys he was playing with basically back in the 60s. These guys really stuck together, so they knew each other really well musically too. Anyways, this could be a very long story, so I got to cut this short, but this is a neat story. So every day at the end of the session, he'd start playing around with these chords, and the production manager would say, so what are you doing here, Gordon? Like this doesn't sound anything like the other stuff. He says, I got this song going on in my head. I've had it for a while. And finally, after a few days of this, the production guy said, come on, let's just try it out. Let's see where we get. So he had the music with him, so he handed it out to his bandmates, and the drummer looked at the music and said, so when exactly am I coming in? And Gordon said, when I nod at you, you start playing. And so the production guys set up whatever they do there, and they did a take of it, and that's the take you hear every time you hear it on the radio. They did it in one take. And the other guys in the band had never seen this music until that moment, and that to me is so amazing. So the album was released. This was the second single off of the album, released in the fall of 1976. In Canada, now you have to understand the 1970s. This was the era of Shake Your Boogie, I think, was one of the songs that fall. Disco Duck, if you ever remember the song Disco Duck, that was a #1 song that fall as well, too. So in Canada, it went to the top of 3 charts. So it went to the top 40 chart, adult contemporary chart, and also the country western chart. In the United States, it made it to #2, but it was blocked getting to #1 by that iconic hit, Tonight's the Night by Rod Stewart. So Rod Stewart beat it out. So which song has more staying power now? So, but I don't look across the border and shake my head at the Americans for their bad taste in music, because that fall, Disco Duck was the #1 hit for 1 week in the United States, 3 weeks #1 in Canada. So shows you what ours is. Anyways, it became this song that when you hear those opening chords in the guitar, I'm already getting chills thinking about it, knowing we're going to get to listen to it in a moment. It is an absolutely beautiful song about an absolutely horrible day. So just to finish up, a couple of things to keep in mind, that as we travel around the Great Lakes, if you haven't already, you might see some of a huge amount of memorabilia that they have. This happened in 1975, so what does that mean? This is the 50th anniversary this year, so you're going to get even more talk about it. And in fact, there's an event that's happening in July. Keep an eye out for it on social media and on the news. It's called the Edmund Fitzgerald Memorial Swim. Get this. They've gotten permission to start the swim over top at the surface of where the wreck takes place. They have teams of 4. They can stay in the water for up to half an hour at a time, and they take turns swimming, because you're not going to last much longer than half an hour. They are recreating the rest of the trip of the Edmund Fitzgerald from where it sunk down to Zug Island, where we were outside of Detroit. It's sold out in the sense that you had to sign up for it. You have to be able to swim a mile uninterrupted. Your speed doesn't matter, but you have to be able to swim a mile, which is 64 lengths in an average swimming pool. And you have to do a lot of fundraising, and all the money, all the profits from this are going to that museum at Whitefish Point where the bell is. So keep an ear out for that starting in July of this year. But at the end of the day, it was an incredible tragedy, and it was those family members, those wives, sons, daughters, mothers, fathers, aunts and uncles, nephews and nieces. Captain sorely, like I said, joined with 28 other men. 4 of them were in their 20s, including one that was just 20, hadn't even turned 21 years old. There was a steward. The steward that was on, he was only on to fill in for the regular steward who had hurt his foot. There were veterans of both World War II and the Korean War on here as well, too. So these are the faces that you want to remember when you hear this song. So let's finish off now with the song itself before I send you on your way. So this was a recording done in the 1970s. 1979. I couldn't remember for a second. In 1979 in Chicago for a show on PBS called Soundstage. There's lots of other recordings out there. This one is still, it's very, very fresh. Quick question before we start. Okay, let's do the personal question real quick because I won't be able to take any questions after. Some of you have to get to your Explorer Society party. So my personal connection is that just a few days before the Edmund Fitzgerald sunk, I was 7 at the time. I was born in 1968. My uncle, my mom's younger brother, he was 25 years old at the time. He was living in New Zealand with some friends, and he drowned there. And so on the night that the Edmund Fitzgerald sunk, that storm of the 9th and the 10th, I so remember that storm because we had to go over to my aunt's to help plan the funeral. And of course, my sister and I, younger than me, had to go with them. And I remember getting in and out of the car at our place and at my aunt's place, how hard it was to open the door. The wind was so, and so much snow. Like it was for us in Canada, the next day, the 11th was Remembrance Day. It's a holiday. We honor our veterans on that day. And it was unusual to have that big of a storm at that time. And I also remember because that's how my mom, because this was in the news so much. And when I was asking questions about the Edmund Fitzgerald, she was explaining to me by talking about my Uncle Jack, because he had drowned, and these men drowned like my Uncle Jack drowned. So that's what I think of when I think about this. Anyways, let's go on to a beautiful song instead of my depressing story. So here is Gordon Lightfoot and his band with The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald.
The legend lives on from the Chippewa down of the big lake they call Gitchagome. The lake, it is said, never gives up for dead when the skies of November turn gloomy. With the load of iron ore, 26,000 tons more than the Edmund Fitzgerald weighed empty. That big ship and true was a bone to bitch when the gales of November came early. The ship was the pride of the American side, coming back from some mill in Wisconsin. As the big freighters go, it was bigger than most, with a crew and good captain well seasoned, concluding some terms with a couple of steel firms when they left fully loaded for Cleveland. And later that night when the ship's bell rang, could it be the north wind they'd been feeling? The wind and the wires made a tattletale sound, and a wave broke over the railing. And every man knew, as the captain did too, 'twas the witch of November come stealing. The dawn came late and the breakfast had to wait when the gales of November came slashing. When afternoon came, it was freezing rain in the face of a hurricane west wind. When supper time came, the old cook came on deck saying, fellas, it's too rough to feed you. At 7 p.m. a main hatchway gave in. He said, fellas, it's been good to know ya. The captain wired in, he had water coming in, and the big ship and crew was in peril. his lights went out of sight, came the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. Does anyone know where the love of God goes when the waves turn the minutes to hours? The searchers all say they've made Whitefish Bay if they put 15 more miles behind her. They might have split up or they might have capsized, they may have broke deep and took water. And all that remains is the faces and the names of the wives and the sons and the daughters. Lake Huron rolls the burial scenes in the rooms of her ice water mansion. Old Michigan steams like a young man's dreams. The islands and days are for sportsmen. And farther below Lake Ontario, it takes in what Lake Erie can send her. But the iron boats go as the mariners all know, with the gales of November remembered. In a musty old hall in Detroit, they prayed in the Maritime Sailors' Cathedral. The church bell chimed till it rang 29 times for each man on the Edmund Fitzgerald. The legend lives on from the Chippewa town of the big lake they call Gitchaguri. Superior, they say, never gives up for dead when the gales of November come early.